He divorced her in front of 50 witnesses, called her defective, broken goods, said it loud enough that the entire dining room heard, loud enough that her mother-in-law stopped mid-bite, loud enough that the waiter froze with a wine bottle hovering over the table. "She can't give me children," Daniel Cross had said, his voice carrying that particular tone of a man who believes he's being reasonable. "What's the point of keeping her?" 6 months later, Serafina Hartley stood in a basement that smelled like formaldehyde and government-issued floor cleaner, filing autopsy reports for bodies that had been drained of every drop of blood. She had $9 in her bank account, a hole in her left shoe that let in every puddle on the Savannah sidewalk, and the attention of a 400-year-old vampire king who knew her secret. The secret Daniel never discovered in 6 years of marriage. The secret that made her infertility not a defect but a dormant power, waiting for the right catalyst. 3 weeks later, the Vampire King walked into a courtroom where Daniel was trying to reclaim her. He didn't ask permission. He simply sat down behind Serafina close enough that Daniel could see him, close enough that every person in that room felt the temperature drop 3 degrees, and he whispered 5 words loud enough for her ex-husband to hear. Let him watch what he lost. This is how Serafina Hartley went from worthless to priceless. This is how a woman with $9 and a hole in her shoe became the most protected human in the American South. This is how Daniel Cross learned that some mistakes you don't get to fix. The shoe gave up first. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone would notice from the outside. Just a slow separation of sole from leather. Right at the ball of Serafina's left foot, the kind of failure that happens when you walk 12 blocks twice a day for 6 months because bus fare costs $1.75, and you need that $1.75 for the difference between eating twice or once. October in Savannah was doing that thing it does, where the humidity refuses to acknowledge that autumn exists anywhere else in the country. The air sat thick and wet against her skin. Her blouse stuck to her spine. The hole in her shoe let in a puddle outside the coffee shop on Broughton Street, and the cold water soaked through her sock. And Serafina kept walking because stopping meant being late, and being late meant Ruth Monroe's disappointed face. And Ruth Monroe's disappointed face was somehow worse than wet feet. The Chatham County Medical Examiner's office occupied the basement level of the federal building on Montgomery Street. Serafina had been walking past it twice a day for years without knowing it existed. The entrance was around the side down a short flight of concrete stairs that always had leaves collecting in the corners, no matter how often maintenance swept them. A door with frosted glass, a placard that said, "Authorized personnel only," in letters that had faded to the point of illegibility. She'd found the job listing pinned to a corkboard at the public library. Handwritten in precise block letters on an index card that looked like it had been produced on a typewriter from 1970. Administrative assistant needed. Discretion required. Unusual hours. No experience necessary. The handwriting had been so old-fashioned that Serafina almost didn't call the number. Almost kept walking past that corkboard back to the studio apartment above the laundromat where the smell of other people's fabric softener had permanently embedded itself in her mattress. But she'd called. And Ruth Monroe had answered on the second ring, her voice rough from what Serafina would later learn was a 40-year menthol cigarette habit, and said, "You got a gap in your employment history." "I was married," Serafina had said. The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Serafina's stomach to clench, long enough for her to think, here we go. Here's the part where I have to explain why being someone's wife was a full-time job that left no room for actual employment. Here's the part where I have to make 6 years of my life sound less pathetic than they were. Ruth said, "You start Monday, don't be late, and don't ask questions about the files marked with the red seal." That had been 6 months ago. 24 weeks of filing autopsy reports. 24 weeks of transcribing pathologist notes in a windowless office that was always exactly 64 degrees regardless of the season. 24 weeks of learning that death, despite what the movies suggested, was mostly paperwork. People died. Paperwork followed. Someone had to make sure the paperwork was accurate, complete, and stored in the correct filing cabinet. That someone was Serafina. She was good at it. Quiet, detail-oriented, invisible. All the qualities Daniel had cultivated in her during their marriage, the ones she'd hated herself for developing, turned out to be exactly what a basement morgue office needed. Ruth noticed. Ruth noticed everything, despite pretending she didn't. "You reorganized the filing system," Ruth had said one morning, 3 weeks into Serafina's employment, not looking up from the incident report she was reviewing. "The alphanumeric code wasn't cross-referencing with the digital database properly," Serafina had said. I added a tertiary identifier. Ruth had looked at her then, really looked. The kind of look that felt like being read instead of seen. Your ex-husband was an idiot, Ruth had said. Then she'd gone back to her paperwork, and Serafina had gone back to filing, and neither of them had mentioned it again. But the Red Seal files, those were different. They'd started appearing in Serafina's second week. Not in the regular filing queue, not dropped off by the courier who brought the standard intake forms from the hospital. These arrived directly on her desk, always when she wasn't looking. She'd go to the bathroom, come back, and there would be a folder. Thicker than the standard ones. Heavier paper, sealed with actual wax in dark crimson, the kind of thing Serafina associated with historical documents or wedding invitations from people who had more money than sense. The cases inside described deaths that didn't make sense. Bodies drained of blood without a wound large enough to account for the loss. Toxicology results showing compounds that didn't exist in any pharmaceutical database Serafina could access. Corpses found with marks on their throats that the pathologist would describe in the preliminary notes, then omit entirely from the final report. And underneath the pathologist's neat typed observations, handwritten annotations in a script Serafina didn't recognize. Notes that read like someone was tracking patterns, following connections, building a case that no official report would ever acknowledge. Serafina filed them where Ruth told her to file them. In a locked cabinet in the back room that required a key Ruth had given her on the third week, a small brass key that Serafina wore on a chain around her neck, tucked under her blouse where no one could see it. She did not ask questions, but she noticed everything. She noticed that the Red Seal cases came in clusters. 3 in 1 week, then nothing for 2 weeks, then 5 in 3 days. She noticed that the compounds in the toxicology reports were always the same. An unknown protein. Molecular structure the lab couldn't identify. Present in every victim. She noticed that the marks on the throats were always symmetrical. 2 punctures. Precise. Clean. The kind of precision that required either a very steady hand or a very specific tool. She noticed that the temperature in the basement corridor dropped approximately 4 degrees 6 minutes before Ruth would appear in the doorway and say, "Someone's coming, finish what you're doing and go home early." Serafina never saw who was coming. She always left before they arrived, until week 24. Serafina had stayed late to finish a backlog of transcriptions. Ruth had already gone home smoking her evening menthol on the way out, leaving a trail of smoke that hung in the stairwell like evidence. The building was quiet. The kind of aggressive silence that government buildings develop after hours, as if the architecture itself wants everyone to leave. 7:45 p.m., the overhead fluorescence hummed. Serafina's fingers moved across the keyboard, transferring the pathologist's audio notes into typed text. A 53-year-old male. Cause of death, exsanguination. No wounds consistent with the blood loss observed. Toxicology pending. She saved the file, stood, gathered the stack of Red Seal folders that needed to go to the locked cabinet. The corridor stretched ahead of her. 40 feet of linoleum tile, walls painted institutional beige, doors on either side, all closed, all dark. The temperature dropped, 4 degrees in 6 seconds. Serafina felt it against her skin. The sudden coolness, the way the air shifted from stale warmth to something sharper. 6 minutes early, her brain supplied. Whatever pattern Ruth had been tracking, it was 6 minutes early tonight. She should have left. Ruth's instructions had been clear. When the temperature drops, go home. But Serafina was holding 6 Red Seal folders, and the locked cabinet was at the end of the corridor, and leaving them on her desk overnight felt wrong, in a way she couldn't articulate. These were evidence. Evidence of something. Evidence that someone wanted preserved, even if no official report would acknowledge it. She walked. The fluorescent lights flickered once, steadied. Her footsteps echoed, soft rubber soles on linoleum, the sound too loud in the silence. She turned the corner. He was standing at the end of the corridor, not approaching, not arriving, simply there in a spot where no one had been standing 30 seconds earlier, as if he'd materialized out of the beige paint and fluorescent hum and government-issue floor tiles. Serafina's first thought was not that he was handsome. Her first thought was that he was wrong. Something about the way he occupied space. The proportions of him. Too still, too composed. Like a photograph that had been inserted into reality and didn't quite match the lighting. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, narrow at the waist, dark hair cut short enough to be professional, long enough to suggest he didn't care much about professional. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the collar open in a way that should have looked casual, but instead looked like a predator keeping its claws sheathed. His face was the problem. Not because it was ugly, because it was too composed, too still. The kind of face that looked like it had been arranged rather than grown, every feature in deliberate proportion. And the eyes, dark gray with a cold silver rim around the iris like storm clouds backlit by the moon. Those eyes were already on her when she turned the corner, already watching, as if he'd heard her coming from 50 feet away and simply waited. The folders nearly slipped from Serafina's arms. She caught them, clutched them to her chest. Did the thing her body wanted to do least, and her brain knew she needed to do most. She stood still. "You must be the new hire," he said. His voice was not what she expected. She'd braced for something deep and resonant, the Hollywood monster voice. Instead, his voice was quiet, controlled. The voice of someone who had learned maybe centuries ago that speaking softly forced people to lean in, and leaning in meant they were already closer than they'd intended to be. "Serafina Hartley," she said, her own voice steadier than she'd expected. "Administrative assistant, and you are in a restricted corridor after business hours without a visitor badge." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, a reaction to something unexpected, like hearing a house cat growl at a wolf. "My name is Marcus Ashford," he said. "I fund this office." Serafina blinked. She looked at the stack of red seal folders in her arms, then back at him. "You fund the medical examiner's office. Certain operations within it." His gaze dropped to the chain around her neck where the key hung, then returned to her face. "The ones you've been filing in the locked cabinet. You haven't asked a single question about those files in 6 months. That's either remarkable discipline or remarkable incuriosity, and I don't think you're incurious. I was told not to ask questions." "You were told not to ask questions about the red seal. You weren't told not to notice patterns." He took one step forward, not aggressive, deliberate, the movement soundless. His shoes on the linoleum produced nothing. No squeak, no tap, no friction, as if the floor had agreed not to acknowledge him. "You've noticed patterns, haven't you, Serafina?" The way he said her name made something clench low in her stomach. Not fear, not exactly. Something adjacent to fear that shared its neighborhood but lived in a different house. "I've noticed," she said carefully, "that the bodies in those files died in ways that don't match any pathology I've read about. I've noticed that the toxicology reports contain compounds that aren't in any database I can access. And I've noticed that someone is altering the final reports to remove details that appear in the preliminary notes." She paused. "I've also noticed that this corridor drops about 4 degrees in temperature, approximately 6 minutes before someone arrives. Except tonight you're 6 minutes early, which suggests either my observation was incomplete or the pattern changed." Both corners of his mouth moved this time, closer to a smile but still not one. The expression of someone who had just been given a gift they hadn't expected. "6 minutes," he repeated. "You timed it. I'm observant. My ex-husband trained me to be observant. He didn't mean to. He was training me to be afraid. Turns out the skill set is the same." Something shifted behind Marcus Ashford's eyes. Not pity. Serafina had learned to recognize pity the way some people recognized a change in the weather, and this wasn't it. This was closer to recognition. The look of someone who understood what it cost to turn a survival mechanism into a weapon. "I need to show you something," he said. "Not tonight. You're tired, and what I have to say requires your full attention. But soon." He reached into his jacket and interior pocket and produced a card. Matte black. No logo, no design. Just a phone number embossed in dark ink that caught the light at certain angles. "When you're ready, call this number. Someone will bring you to me. And if I'm not ready, then I'll wait." He turned to leave, and Serafina noticed for the first time that he moved without sound. Not quietly. Without sound. His shoes on the linoleum produced nothing, as if physics had taken a break just for him. He stopped at the end of the corridor. "Still facing away from here. One more thing," he said. "The man who drives past your building at 2 in the morning, the one in the silver sedan, he's been photographing your windows for the last 9 days." Serafina's heart stopped. "I've had someone watching him." Marcus continued, his voice still quiet, still controlled. "He is not a threat I will allow to reach you, but you should know that he's escalating." The corridor was empty by the time Serafina's heart started beating again. Daniel. She stood in the silence of the basement, holding red seal files against her chest, a black card in her free hand, and the certain bone-deep knowledge that everything she understood about the world had just developed a crack. And through that crack, something was looking back at her. She did not call the number that night. Serafina went home, double-locked her door, checked every window, sat on her bed with the lights on until 3 in the morning, turning the black card over in her fingers. Matte, expensive cardstock. The kind of thing you ordered from a printer who didn't advertise prices on their website. The number was embossed, not printed. She could feel it under her fingertips. 10 digits, a local area code. At 3:15, she put the card in the drawer of her nightstand, took 2 ibuprofen for the headache blooming behind her eyes, slept for 4 hours. In the morning, she went to work, filed reports, transcribed notes, ate a sandwich at her desk that cost $2.17 from the convenience store 3 blocks away. She did not look at the corridor. On the second day, she did look. It was empty. On the third day, she found a sealed envelope on her desk that hadn't been there when she'd gone to the bathroom. Inside was a single photograph taken from a high angle showing a silver sedan parked across the street from her building. The timestamp on the photo was 2:17 in the morning. Through the car's windshield, illuminated by the glow of his phone, she could see Daniel's face. The face she'd woken up next to for 6 years. The face that smiled at dinner parties and introduced her as my wife, with the same tone someone might say, my car or my watch. The face that had decided she wasn't worth keeping. On the back of the photograph in handwriting she didn't recognize were 4 words. He hired a locksmith. Serafina picked up her phone, took the black card from her desk drawer where she'd moved it that morning, called the number. It rang twice. Serafina, Marcus Ashford's voice. That same quiet control. He'd answered as if they were continuing a conversation rather than starting one. He hired a locksmith, she said. I know, that's why I left the photograph. I wanted you to have the information without me making the decision for you. He paused. If you want to handle this through human channels, police report, upgraded locks, I'll make sure the evidence reaches the right desk. If you want something more comprehensive, come to me. What does comprehensive mean? It means I tell you what I am, what this office really does, why your blood pressure drops 3 points every time you walk past the locked cabinet, which is not a normal physiological response, and suggests something about your biology that I need to confirm. Another pause. And it means I explain why a man like Daniel Cross, who should be a nuisance and nothing more, has recently been in contact with people who make him look like a parking violation. That last sentence sat in her chest like a swallowed stone. When she asked, tonight if you can, Ruth will give you the address. She knows. Ruth knows. Ruth knows everything. She has for 31 years. Who do you think wrote that job listing? He hung up. Serafina stared at her phone for a long time. Then she walked to Ruth's office, knocked and said, I need the address. Ruth didn't look up from her paperwork. Took you long enough. She slid a folded piece of paper across the desk. Wear comfortable shoes, honey. It's a walk. The address led Serafina to a townhouse on East Jones Street, one of those narrow Savannah homes with wrought iron balconies and windows that had been watching the street since before the Civil War. Nothing about it suggested anything other than old money and quiet taste. No signs, no symbols, just a dark green door with a brass knocker shaped like a closed fist. Serafina knocked. The door opened, immediately pulled inward by a woman who looked about 35 with red hair, pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of posture that suggested either military training or ballet. Miss Hartley, I'm Vivian. Follow me, please. The interior of the townhouse was warm in a way that surprised Serafina. She'd expected something cold, something gothic. Instead, she found hardwood floors, bookshelves, lamps with warm bulbs and the smell of coffee. Real fresh coffee, not the institutional sludge from the office machine. Vivian led her down a hallway through a kitchen that was fully stocked and clearly used and into a sitting room at the back of the house. Marcus Ashford sat in a leather armchair with a glass of something dark red in his hand. He stood when she entered. It was a small gesture, standing when a woman enters a room, the kind of thing her grandmother would have appreciated. And it struck Serafina that the gesture felt practiced in the way of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. Not habit learned in childhood, habit calcified over decades, maybe longer. Sit, please. He gestured to the chair across from him. There's coffee if you want it, or something stronger. Coffee. Vivian disappeared. She returned with a cup that was perfect. The right temperature, the right amount of cream. Serafina wondered briefly if that was a coincidence or if someone had been paying attention to how she took it at the office. The second option should have unsettled her more than it did. You said you'd tell me what you are, Serafina said. Marcus set down his glass. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and those gray silver eyes held hers without blinking. I'm going to tell you a word, he said, and I want you to notice your own reaction. Not what you think the reaction should be, what it actually is. Okay. Vampire. Serafina's reaction was not what she expected. No spike of fear, no surge of adrenaline, no instinctive recoil. Instead, something settled, like a puzzle piece dropping into a space she'd been staring at for 6 months without realizing it was empty. The temperature drops, the soundless movement, the drained bodies in the files, the red seal. The fact that Ruth, who chain-smoked menthols and ran an office next to a morgue, had been keeping secrets for 31 years. Okay, Serafina said. Marcus waited. He seemed to be waiting for more. The scream maybe, the bolt for the door, the accusations of insanity. I've been filing autopsy reports on exsanguinated bodies for 6 months, Serafina continued. I've watched you appear and disappear in a corridor with no exits. You don't breathe unless you're talking. Your skin doesn't change temperature despite being in a building with inconsistent heating. And Ruth put me in this job on purpose, which means this was always where I was going to end up. She took a sip of coffee. Perfect temperature. Perfect cream ratio. The question isn't whether I believe you, she said. The question is why you're telling me. And there it was, the thing that made Marcus Ashford's composure slip for the first time since she'd met him. Not a crack. More like a window opening in a wall she hadn't realized was sealed. Something behind his eyes surfaced, raw and startled and almost young, as if the centuries hadn't quite extinguished the capacity for surprise. Because you're in danger, he said. The rawness stayed in his voice despite his obvious effort to push it back under. And because the danger you're in is my fault. Serafina set down her coffee. Explain. Marcus stood. He walked to the window, looked out at the darkening street, spoke to the glass. 43 years ago, I made a mistake. I let a human woman get close to me. Not romantically, although people gossiped otherwise. She was a researcher, a forensic pathologist named Dr. Margot Hartley. The room went very quiet, not the artificial silence of a government basement, the living silence of a space holding its breath. She worked in the same medical examiner's office where you work now, Marcus continued. She was brilliant, and she was the first human in decades who figured out what the Red Seal cases actually were. He paused. Your mother's name is Catherine. Catherine Hartley née Robichaud. Margot was your grandmother. My grandmother died when I was 4, Serafina said. Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. My mother told me she had a heart attack. Your grandmother died because I failed to protect her. Marcus turned from the window. His face held the particular stillness of someone delivering a confession they'd been carrying for decades. She discovered that a rogue faction operating in the Savannah area was feeding on humans indiscriminately, violating every agreement that keeps our existence viable. She confronted me. She demanded I act. I told her to stay out of it, that it was vampire business, that I would handle it in my own time. His jaw tightened. She didn't stay out of it. She gathered evidence, documented the kills, identified the rogues. She was going to go public. Not about vampires, she wasn't that reckless, but about the pattern of deaths, the cover-ups, the failures in the medical examiner's reporting. And the rogues found out before I could stop them. He met her eyes. They made her death look like a heart attack. It wasn't. And I have spent 43 years making sure that what happened to her could never happen to someone in that office again. The job listing was mine. The Red Seal system was mine. Ruth was mine. He paused again. The weight of the next sentence showed in the way his shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. I put you in that office, Serafina. Not directly. I didn't know you existed until 6 months ago. But the listing was designed to attract a very specific kind of person. Someone careful. Someone quiet. Someone who would notice the patterns and have the discipline not to pursue them until I was ready to explain. When your application came in, Ruth called me. She recognized your last name. Serafina's hands were steady around her coffee cup, which surprised her because the inside of her chest felt like it was being disassembled brick by brick. You put me in that job because of my grandmother. I put you in that job because the rogue faction that killed your grandmother is active again. More active than they've been in decades. And 3 weeks ago, they identified you. Me, why? Because your grandmother's research didn't die with her. She left documentation. Detailed, meticulous damning. It's been hidden for 43 years in a place only her bloodline can access. I don't know where. I've spent 4 decades trying to find it. The rogues have spent 4 decades trying to find it. He moved closer. Not threatening, deliberate. And now you're here. And your ex-husband, who is a petty controlling man with no connection to the supernatural world whatsoever, has been in contact with people who are very much connected. Not because he knows what they are, because they approached him. Because they know that the fastest way to get to a woman who's been conditioned to respond to pressure is to use the person who conditioned her. The stone that had been sitting in Serafina's chest since Marcus mentioned Daniel on the phone grew heavier. Daniel is working with vampires. Daniel is being used by vampires. There's a difference, though the result for you is the same. They feed him resources, legal connections, private investigators. He thinks he's found wealthy backers who sympathize with his situation. What he's actually found is a faction that needs him to keep you destabilized, monitored, and eventually accessible. Serafina stood. She crossed the room to the window where Marcus had been standing, looked out at Jones Street. A couple walked past under the live oaks, laughing about something completely unaware that 20 feet away a woman was learning that her grandmother had been murdered by monsters, and her ex-husband was being puppeted by the same breed of monster 43 years later. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "I want to protect you. I owe your family that. I failed Margot, and the debt doesn't expire." "That's guilt, not a plan." "The plan," Marcus said, moving to stand beside her at the window close enough that she could feel the subtle coolness that surrounded him. Not cold, just a few degrees below room temperature, a body that generated less heat than it should. "The plan is for you to help me find your grandmother's research before the rogues do. The plan is for me to dismantle the faction that killed her and neutralize the threat to you permanently." He paused. "And the plan, if I'm being completely honest, is for me to figure out why every instinct I've developed over 400 years of careful isolation is telling me that letting you walk out of this house tonight would be the worst decision I've ever made. And I've made some catastrophic ones." Serafina looked at him. This close, she could see details she'd missed in the basement corridor. A thin scar along his hairline barely visible. The faintest asymmetry in his jaw, as if it had been broken once and healed slightly wrong. The shadows under his eyes that had nothing to do with sleeplessness and everything to do with the particular fatigue of someone who has been awake for a very long time. He was not beautiful. She wanted to be precise about that. He was compelling in the way that a building on fire is compelling. You couldn't look away, but the looking carried weight. "I have conditions," she said. "Of course you do. You don't make decisions for me, not about my safety, not about my schedule, not about anything. You give me information and I decide what to do with it. I spent 6 years with a man who thought he knew what was best for me. I'm done with that model regardless of species." Marcus's expression did something complicated. Several things moved behind his eyes at once. None of them the condescension she'd been bracing for. "Agreed," he said. "What else?" "You tell me everything, not what you think I can handle. Everything. The moment you start filtering information to protect me, we're done." "That will be difficult. Some of what I know is genuinely dangerous to hear." "I didn't say it would be comfortable. I said it was a condition." He studied her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have. "Your grandmother used to say something similar," he said. "She told me that the only thing more dangerous than the truth was a well-intentioned lie. I didn't listen to her either." He paused. "I'll do better this time." Serafina extended her hand. It was a deliberate choice. A handshake, not an embrace. A negotiation, not a surrender. Marcus took it. His grip was firm, his skin cool. And when their hands met, Serafina felt something she'd been expecting to feel ever since he'd said the word vampire. A current, not electric, not supernatural in any way she could identify. More like the sensation of touching a wire that was carrying information. A transmission she couldn't decode. Marcus felt it too. She saw it in the way his fingers tightened almost imperceptibly before he let go. "Tomorrow," he said, "Ruth will brief you on the parts she knows. I'll fill in the rest. And Serafina?" He walked her to the front door where Vivienne was already waiting with a car idling at the curb. "I've assigned 2 of my people to your building. Not inside, outside. They will not enter your home, monitor your phone, or interfere with your life in any way. They are there for one purpose: to make sure the rogues don't reach you and Daniel doesn't get brave." Serafina stepped onto the porch. The Savannah night was warm and smelled like jasmine and river water, and the particular ghost of something that might have been history or might have been grief. "Marcus," she said, turning back, "my grandmother's research. If we find it, what happens? If we find it, I have what I need to bring the rogue faction before the court of the Southern Reach. My court, where I hold authority and they hold nothing. I destroy them legally permanently, and the threat to you ends. And if we don't find it, his expression darkened, then I destroy them the other way. And the threat to you still ends. I just prefer the version with less blood. He closed the door. Serafina got in the car. Vivian drove her home in silence, walked her to her building entrance, and said exactly one sentence before leaving. He hasn't slept in 11 days. Since your application came across Ruth's desk, just so you know the weight of what you're carrying. Serafina climbed the stairs to her apartment, checked the locks, sat on her bed, and for the first time in 6 months, she did not think about Daniel. She thought about a grandmother she barely remembered. A woman who had walked into a world of monsters and demanded they behave. A woman who had been killed for it. A woman whose research, whatever it contained, was apparently still dangerous enough that two factions of vampires were willing to go to war over it. Serafina Hartley had spent 6 years being managed, being diminished, being handled. She was done being handled. Outside her window, the city moved through its evening routine. Cars passing, voices drifting up from the street, the distant sound of a train whistle from the industrial quarter. And somewhere in that city, standing watch in the shadows, two vampires were making sure that Daniel Cross and his new backers didn't get within 100 yards of her door. The hole in her shoe didn't matter anymore. The $9 in her bank account didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that a 400-year-old vampire king with gray silver eyes and a 43-year-old debt had just made her a promise. And Serafina had the distinct impression that Marcus Ashford did not break his promises. Not anymore. Not after what breaking one had cost him. The coffee in Ruth Monroe's office was the same institutional sludge that had been coming out of the same machine for what Serafina suspected was longer than she'd been alive. Ruth drank it anyway. Black. No sugar. Like penance. 2 weeks had passed since the townhouse on East Jones Street. 2 weeks of working side by side with Ruth, filing the same reports, maintaining the same careful silence about the Red Seal files. But something had shifted. The silence felt different now. Less like secrecy and more like preparation. Ruth lit a menthol at her desk despite the no-smoking signs on every wall, cracked the window exactly 2 inches, the precise margin she'd negotiated with a building maintenance 15 years ago. Your grandmother was a pain in my ass, Ruth said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke through the window gap. Serafina said nothing, waited. Brilliant woman, absolutely fearless. And she had the irritating habit of being right about things nobody wanted to hear. Ruth stubbed out the cigarette with the efficiency of long practice, looked at Serafina with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. I was her assistant, same job you have now, different decade. Margot trained me. She's the one who set up the Red Seal system. Before her, the anomalous cases just disappeared. Coroners destroyed the files. Police departments buried them. Families were paid off. Margot put the system in place to preserve the evidence, even if no one was ready to act on it. And Marcus funded it. Marcus has funded this office since 1897. Different names, obviously. Different faces in the community. But always the same operation, his territory, his responsibility. Ruth pulled another cigarette from the pack but didn't light it, just held it. The man takes his obligations seriously. Maybe too seriously. Serafina filed that observation away for later. What do you know about the research my grandmother hid? Ruth's expression changed, not dramatically, a tightening around the eyes, a slight flattening of the mouth, the face of a woman deciding how much truth to dispense. I know she spent the last 3 years of her life documenting something she called the ledger. Not a physical book, a compiled record, evidence testimony, forensic analysis, genetic profiles. Everything she'd gathered about rogue vampire activity in the Southeast. Names, locations, feeding patterns, financial networks. Ruth finally lit the second cigarette. She told me once that if the ledger ever reached the right hands, it would be enough to dismantle the entire rogue infrastructure, not just in Savannah, across the whole southern reach. And she hid it. She hid it because the night before she planned to deliver it to Marcus, someone in his inner circle betrayed her location to the rogues. She never told me who. She just showed up at my apartment at 4 in the morning, calm as a corpse, and told me that the ledger was safe, that only her blood could find it, and that if anything happened to her, I should make sure the office kept running until someone with her blood walked through the door. Yeah, Ruth looked at Serafina with an expression that contained 31 years of patience and grief. I've been waiting for you, honey. Not you specifically. I didn't know Margot had a granddaughter until your application landed on my desk. But I've been keeping the lights on, filing the red seals, watching for the person Margot promised would come. The weight of that statement settled on Serafina's shoulders like a physical thing. Someone in Marcus's inner circle betrayed her, she said. Not a question. That's the part that keeps me awake, Ruth said. Whatever Margot found, it was bad enough that someone close to the king decided she needed to die rather than let it reach him, which means either the betrayer is still in Marcus's circle or they've been replaced by someone equally compromised. She paused. Either way, there's rot near the top. And until you find the ledger and prove who it was, you can't fully trust anyone in his court, including him. You trust him. I trust that his guilt over Margot is genuine. Guilt is a reliable motivator. Ruth crushed out the cigarette. But guilt and competence are different currencies. And the man has a blind spot the size of Texas when it comes to the people closest to him. He sees loyalty because he wants to see loyalty. Margot saw the truth. That's what got her killed. Marcus picked her up at 7, not in something flashy, a dark blue sedan that could have belonged to anyone. He drove at exactly the speed limit with both hands on the wheel, like someone who had learned to drive from a manual rather than from instinct. You drive, Serafina said. She'd half expected him to materialize on Whitaker Street the way he materialized in basement corridors. I've been driving since cars were invented. Seemed wasteful not to learn. He glanced at her. Disappointed. Surprise. The soundless corridor thing made me think you preferred drama. The corridor thing isn't drama, it's efficiency. Why make noise if you don't have to? They drove through evening Savannah, the city doing its golden hour routine, light slanting through live oaks, shadows long and soft, tourists on ghost tours gathering at street corners, listening to guides spin stories about hauntings and history, completely unaware that something far stranger than ghosts was driving past them in a sensible sedan. 27 Whitaker Street was a 2-story wooden frame painted pale yellow with green shutters. A porch light burned. The garden was overgrown in the artful way of someone who preferred wildness to order. And along the south wall, beneath the bay window on the second floor, a wall of jasmine climbed a trellis that looked original to the house. Marcus parked across the street, killed the engine. His hand stayed on the steering wheel a moment too long. You don't have to come in, Serafina said. I'm not coming in. I'll be here. He looked at her. This is your blood, Serafina. Whatever Margot left, she left it for someone like you. I'm the man who failed her. I don't get to be part of the recovery. She got out of the car before she could respond to that, because responding would have meant acknowledging the grief in his voice. And if she acknowledged it, she might have to acknowledge her own. The professor's name was Dr. Arthur Clement. He was 71, a retired historian who specialized in Savannah's antebellum period. He opened the door in a cardigan and reading glasses with the cautious friendliness of a man who wasn't expecting visitors, but was too polite to say so. Serafina told him the truth, or a version of it. My grandmother lived here in the early 80s. She passed when I was small. I'm trying to reconnect with her memory, and I'd love to see the garden if that's all right. I know it's late, and I apologize for the intrusion. Dr. Clement's face softened. Margot Hartley, he said, surprising her. The previous owners told me about her. Brilliant woman by all accounts. And the jasmine out back. He shook his head. I've never been able to kill it. Not that I've tried. It's the most resilient plant I've ever seen. Come in. Come in. Take all the time you need. The garden was small, enclosed by a brick wall, and the jasmine dominated the south side completely. In the dark, its white flowers glowed faintly, and the smell was so thick Serafina felt like she was breathing through cloth. She stood at the base of the trellis, closed her eyes. The jasmine knows the card had said. She pressed her palm against the wall beneath the vine, felt the old brick, rough and warm even at night. Nothing happened. She moved her hand lower, to the soil line where the jasmine roots disappeared into the earth. Her fingers pushed into the dirt, damp and rich, and she felt along the base of the wall. There, a brick that was slightly recessed. She pushed it, felt it give, sliding inward an inch before catching on something. She pressed harder. A click. The brick beneath it shifted, revealing a narrow gap in the foundation wall, barely wide enough for a hand. Serafina reached in. Her fingers found metal. A box, small like a cigar box wrapped in something waterproof. She pulled it out, heavy for its size. The wrapping was oilskin still intact after 4 decades. Inside the oilskin was a tin box. And inside the tin box was a leather journal, a USB drive in a sealed plastic bag, and a folded letter addressed to no one. Serafina opened the letter. her grandmother's handwriting, angular, precise, familiar in a way that made her chest hurt. If you are reading this, you are my blood. The journal contains what I could not trust to any machine. The drive contains what I could not trust to paper. Together they are the ledger. Everything I found, every name, every kill, every trail of money and influence that the rogue faction has used to operate inside Marcus Ashford's territory for the last 40 years. But the most dangerous thing in this box is not the evidence against the rogues. It is the evidence of who helped them. Marcus's court has a fracture, and it runs deeper than he knows. The person who sold my location to the rogues the night I died was someone he trusted absolutely. I could not prove it in time. The proof is in the ledger. Use it carefully. And if Marcus Ashford is standing next to you when you read this, which knowing him, he probably is, tell him, I said 3 things. 1, I forgive him. 2, I told him so. 3, the person who betrayed me did it out of love for him, which makes it worse, not better. Be careful, little one. The truth is heavy, but you come from women who carry heavy things. No, Serafina read the letter twice. Then she walked back through the house, thanked Dr. Clement, and got into the car where Marcus was waiting with the rigid stillness of someone holding himself together through sheer discipline. She handed him the letter. He read it under the dome light. She watched his face. The composure held. The composure held. And then on the 3rd line it didn't. He turned his face away from her. His hand came up to press against his mouth, and his shoulders moved once. A single convulsion of something he swallowed before it could escape. They sat in the car on Whitaker Street for 11 minutes without speaking. Then Marcus started the engine and drove them to the townhouse where Vivian was waiting, where the coffee was fresh, where the work of dismantling a 43-year-old conspiracy began at 10:14 on a Thursday night in Savannah, Georgia. The journal was everything Margot had promised. Serafina spent 2 days going through it while Marcus's technology specialist, a vampire named Theo, who looked 19 and was actually 105, cracked the encryption on the USB drive. Margot's handwriting filled page after page. Dates, locations, names, victim profiles, forensic details so specific that Serafina could reconstruct entire crime scenes in her mind just from reading the notes. But more than that, financial records, bank transfers, shell companies, a network of money flowing through legitimate businesses and ending up in accounts that funded what Margot called the operation. The operation was human trafficking, not in the modern sense, in a sense far older and far worse. Humans bred specifically to have genetic markers that made them compatible with vampire physiology. Raised in isolation, sold to the highest bidder, used until they broke, disposed of when they were no longer useful. The rogue faction wasn't rogue at all, it was a business. And it had been running in the American South for over a century, funded and protected by someone with enough power to keep it invisible. The name in the ledger made Marcus go very still. Vivian Kane, not the current Vivian, her predecessor, a vampire named Vivienne Laurent, who had served Marcus's court for 170 years before dying in what the official records called a territorial dispute with a rival court. Except the ledger said otherwise. The ledger said Vivienne Laurent had been running the trafficking operation, that she'd been skimming resources from Marcus's territory to fund it, that she'd been providing cover for decades while performing loyalty in the king's presence, and that when Margot discovered it, Vivian had sold Margot's location to the rogues rather than let the evidence reach Marcus. Marcus read the evidence, read it again, asked Theo to verify the digital records independently. Theo verified them. Then Marcus sat in his chair in the sitting room on Jones Street and didn't move for 2 hours. Serafina sat with him. She didn't speak, didn't offer comfort or platitudes or any of the soft, meaningless things people say when the ground opens up under someone they care about. She just sat there, because that was what she'd wished someone had done for her during the worst nights of her marriage. Just been present without trying to fix it. At the 2-hour mark, Marcus spoke. She was with me for 170 years, he said. His voice was flat, scraped clean. She was the first person I turned. I found her in a field hospital during the Napoleonic Wars, dying of a wound no surgeon could close. I gave her the choice. She chose to live. And for 170 years, she was the person I trusted most in the world. Serafina waited. The letter said she did it out of love for me, Marcus continued. That doesn't make it forgivable. It makes it comprehensible. There's a difference. He stood. The flatness left his voice, replaced by something harder. Margot found evidence that Vivian had been running a parallel operation, allowing rogues to feed freely in exchange for intelligence about rival courts. Vivian believed she was protecting me, strengthening my position by weakening others. She didn't see the bodies. She didn't see your grandmother's body. What are you going to do? I'm going to call a session of the Court of the Southern Reach. I'm going to present the ledger, and I'm going to let the court decide Vivian Laurent's fate. Because if I decide it myself, I will want to destroy everything she built, and she deserves a trial more than I deserve the satisfaction. He looked at Serafina. But first we need to deal with Daniel. The motion arrived by courier at 9 in the morning. Legal documents in a manila envelope. Daniel's attorney's letterhead. Cross versus Hartley. Motion to annul the divorce decree on grounds of mental incapacity and undue influence. Serafina read it twice. The language was careful, clinical. It painted a picture of a woman who had been emotionally unstable at the time of the divorce, who had made decisions while under the influence of unnamed outside parties, who had hidden assets and misrepresented her mental state to the court. It was lies. All of it. But they were well-dressed lies, the kind that looked at them good on paper. The hearing was scheduled for 4 days from now, day 22, the same day as the vampire court session. Serafina set the documents down on Marcus's dining table where the ledger was still spread out. Journal pages, printouts from the USB drive, a 43-year-old map of corruption laid bare. He's escalating, she said. Marcus picked up the motion, read it. His jaw tightened in a way that would have been invisible to someone who hadn't been watching him for 2 weeks. He's being pushed, Marcus said. The rogues know we have the ledger. They know what it contains. And they know that if I present it to the court, their entire operation collapses. Daniel is their pressure point. They're using him to destabilize you, to distract me, to buy themselves time. Will it work? Not even slightly. Marcus set down the motion. But we're going to give them what they think they want. We're going to let Daniel think he's winning, and then we're going to take everything from him in the most public way possible. Serafina looked at him. What are you planning? Tomorrow night, the Savannah Memorial Hospital Charity Gala. Daniel will be there. He's on the board, and he'll have his new fiancée with him, a woman named Charlotte something, 24 years old, trust fund, no idea what she's walked into. Marcus's eyes held something cold and precise. I'm going to walk into that gala in front of 200 of Savannah's elite, and I'm going to make it very clear who you belong to. Not because you're property, because you're protected. And because I want Daniel to spend the next 4 days knowing exactly what's coming for him in that courtroom. You're going to claim me publicly. Only if you agree. This is your decision, Serafina, not mine. I can destroy Daniel a dozen different ways. But if you want the satisfaction of watching him lose everything in front of everyone who matters to him, then you need to be there. And you need to let me make it obvious that you are not alone, that you are not unprotected, that you are in fact the single most valuable thing in my 400-year existence. The room was very quiet. He told everyone I was worthless, Serafina said, her voice steady, that keeping me served no purpose. I want them to see how wrong he was. Marcus crossed the room, stopped in front of her, close enough that she could feel the coolness that surrounded him, that constant few degrees below room temperature. Then we'll make sure they know, he said quietly, all of them. The dress was dark green, emerald actually, the color of old money and quiet power. It fit her like it had been made for her, which it probably had been, because when Serafina had asked where it came from, Vivian had just smiled and said, Marcus has excellent taste. Vivian had also done something to Serafina's hair, not styled it into submission, just encouraged it. The result was softer than Serafina was used to, more intentional. You look like someone who belongs exactly where she's going, Vivian said, stepping back to assess her work. Serafina looked at herself in the mirror. The woman looking back was not the woman who had walked 12 blocks with a hole in her shoe 6 months ago. But she wasn't someone else either. She was sharper, more focused, like a photograph finally coming into clarity. He hasn't stopped thinking about you for 2 weeks, Vivian said quietly. I've known Marcus for a very long time. I've never seen him like this. Like what? Hopeful. The Savannah Memorial Hospital Charity Gala was held in the ballroom of the DeSoto Hotel, a historic building with chandeliers and marble floors and the kind of polished elegance that money produced when it had been accumulating for generations. 200 people filled the space, doctors and donors, board members and their spouses, everyone dressed in their best, everyone performing the careful dance of Southern society where the smiles were wide and the knees were hidden. Daniel was easy to spot. He stood near the bar with a woman who had to be Charlotte, young, blonde, wearing a dress that cost more than Serafina used to make in a month. She was laughing at something Daniel had said, her hand on his arm, completely unaware that the man next to her had destroyed his previous marriage through systematic isolation and control. Daniel saw Serafina the moment she entered. His face did something complicated. Surprise, then recognition, then calculation. The same expression he'd worn when he was deciding whether one of her friendships needed to be managed. Serafina held his gaze, didn't look away, didn't smile, just stood there in her emerald dress and let him see that she existed, that she was here, that she had not disappeared into the poverty and shame he'd tried to bury her in. Then Marcus walked in. The room didn't go silent. That only happened in movies. But there was a shift, a subtle redistribution of attention. The way a space reacts when someone important enters. Marcus wore black, a suit that probably cost more than Serafina's rent for a year. No tie. The collar open in that way he had of suggesting formality while refusing to perform it completely. He crossed the ballroom like he owned it, which given the amount of money his various shell companies had probably donated to this hospital over the decades he might actually have. He stopped in front of Serafina. "You look devastating," he said quietly, "just for her." Then he turned to face the room, raised his voice just enough to carry, "Excuse me, I need everyone's attention for a moment." The conversations didn't stop immediately, but they stuttered. People turned. A few board members who clearly recognized Marcus from previous events nudged their companions. The room found its way to quiet. "My name is Marcus Ashford," he said, his voice carrying that same quiet control it always carried, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. "Some of you know me, most of you don't. That's fine. You're about to." He turned to Serafina, held out his hand. She took it. "This woman," Marcus said, "is Serafina Hartley, and I want to make something very clear to everyone in this room. She is under my protection. She is under my care. And she is, as of this moment, the single most important person in my territory." He looked directly at Daniel. "Anyone who challenges that in court, in business, or in any other arena will answer to me, personally. And I promise you that is not a conversation you want to have." The ballroom was completely silent now. Serafina felt every eye in the room on her, felt the weight of 200 people trying to understand what they were witnessing, felt Daniel's stare like a physical thing burning across the space between them. Marcus's hand tightened on hers, just slightly, a reassurance. "Carry on," Marcus said to the room. "Enjoy your evening." And just like that, the noise returned. Conversations resuming, the careful social machinery grinding back into motion. But everything had changed. Serafina saw it in the way people looked at her now. Not with pity, not with curiosity, with something closer to respect. Or maybe caution. The kind of attention you give to someone who has just been marked as untouchable. Daniel was still staring. His face had gone through several more complicated expressions and landed on something that looked like rage wrapped in disbelief, wrapped in the dawning understanding that he had miscalculated badly. Charlotte was tugging on his arm, saying something Serafina couldn't hear. Daniel ignored her. Marcus leaned close to Serafina, his breath cool against her ear. "Do you want to leave, or do you want to stay and watch him try to process this?" "Stay," Serafina said. "Definitely stay." They stayed for an hour. Marcus introduced her to people whose names she would never remember. Board members and donors and a few individuals who gave Marcus looks that suggested they knew exactly what he was, even if they couldn't say it out loud. And through it all, Daniel watched. He tried to approach twice. Both times someone intercepted him. A board member with a question, a waiter with a tray of champagne. Marcus's timing was too perfect for it to be coincidence. When they finally left, walking out through the De Soto's grand entrance to where Vivian was waiting with the car, Serafina looked back once. Daniel stood in the doorway of the ballroom, alone. Charlotte had apparently given up and found someone else to talk to. He looked smaller than she remembered, less like the man who had controlled 6 years of her life and more like what he actually was. A petty, insecure man who had mistaken cruelty for strength and was only now beginning to understand the difference. "Let him watch," Marcus said quietly, following her gaze. "Let him see what he lost. Let him spend the next 4 days knowing that when that courtroom door opens, I'm going to be sitting behind you. And there's nothing he can do about it." Serafina got in the car. Vivian drove them back to the townhouse. And for the first time since the divorce, Serafina felt something unfamiliar spreading through her chest. Not happiness, not yet, but the space where happiness could grow. The knowledge that she was not alone, that she was not powerless, That the man who had tried to erase her had just been erased himself in front of everyone who mattered. The townhouse was quiet when they returned. Theo had gone home. Vivian disappeared upstairs to her quarters. It was just Serafina and Marcus in the sitting room where this had all started 2 weeks ago. The ledger still spread across the dining table. Evidence of 43 years. Proof of betrayal and murder, and a trafficking operation that had destroyed hundreds of lives. But right now, Serafina couldn't think about any of that. Right now, all she could think about was the way Marcus's hand had felt in hers. The way he'd looked at Daniel with that cold precision. The way he'd said, "the single most important person in my territory," like it was fact instead of declaration. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Marcus was pouring coffee. He didn't look up. "I wanted to. You made me a target. You were already a target. I made you a protected target. There's a difference." He handed her the cup. Perfect temperature. Perfect cream ratio. She still didn't know how he did that. "I waited 400 years, Marcus said quietly. 400 years of careful distance. Of not letting anyone get close. Of building walls so high that nothing could touch me. And then Ruth called me 6 months ago and said your name, and every single one of those walls started developing cracks." He sat down across from her. "I told myself it was guilt, that I owed your grandmother a debt, that protecting you was just fulfilling an obligation I'd failed to meet 43 years ago. And maybe that's how it started, but that's not what this is anymore." Serafina set down her cup. "What is it?" "You know what it is." His eyes held hers, gray silver in the lamplight. "You felt it when we shook hands in this room. That current, that transmission. It's not just biology, Serafina. It's not just the genetic compatibility that makes you able to exist in my world without being consumed by it." He leaned forward. "It's you. You're mine. The way you look at problems and find solutions no one else sees. The way you survived 6 years with a man who was trying to break you and came out of it sharper instead of shattered. The way you didn't flinch when I told you what I was. You just adjusted. Like the universe had finally started making sense. I'm not my grandmother. I know. Margot was a force of nature. Brilliant and terrifying and absolutely certain she was right about everything. And she was right. That's what made her terrifying." He paused. "You're different. You question. You weigh evidence. You don't assume you have all the answers. And that makes you more dangerous than she ever was, because you'll see things she would have missed." Serafina stood, crossed to the window, looked out at Jones Street where 2 weeks ago she'd stood in this exact spot and made a deal with a vampire king. "Daniel files that motion in 4 days," she said. "The vampire court session is the same day." "I know. If we go to the vampire court, we might not make it to the human one." "We'll make it. I'll make sure of it." She turned to face him. "Why does this matter so much to you, the human court? You could destroy Daniel 100 different ways. You could make him disappear, make him leave Savannah, make him understand that he's lost without ever setting foot in a courtroom." Marcus stood, walked to where she was standing, close enough that she could feel the temperature differential. Could see the exact moment his breath misted slightly in the warm air because his lungs were degrees cooler than they should be. "Because you deserve to watch him lose the same way he made you feel like you'd lost," Marcus said. "You deserve to sit in that courtroom with me behind you and watch the judge tell him that he was wrong, that the annulment is denied, that you were never mentally incompetent or under undue influence, that you were simply smart enough to leave a man who didn't deserve you." He reached out, hesitated, then touched her face, his fingers cool against her cheek. "I can give you a lot of things, Serafina. Protection, resources, a place in my world that no one can challenge. But I can't give you the vindication of watching the human legal system tell Daniel Cross that he's a failure. Only you can give yourself that. And I want to be there when it happens." Serafina's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Something that felt like it was expanding and contracting at the same time. "You haven't slept in 11 days, she said. "Vivian had told me." "Vivian talks too much." "Do you sleep?" "Sometimes, when I feel safe. I haven't felt safe in a very long time. Because of what happened to my grandmother. Because of a lot of things. Your grandmother. The people I've lost. The mistakes I've made. The century after century of watching humans I cared about age and die while I stayed the same. It's easier not to get close. Easier not to sleep. Easier not to feel safe." He dropped his hand, started to step back. Serafina caught his wrist. "Stay," she said. Marcus went very still. Serafina, I'm not asking you to sleep. I'm asking you to stay. Right here, in this room. Because I don't want to go back to my apartment tonight and sit in the dark wondering if Daniel is going to do something stupid. And I don't want to be alone. I can have Vivian. I don't want Vivian. I want you. The silence stretched between them, long enough for Serafina to hear her own heartbeat, long enough to wonder if she'd miscalculated, if the current she'd felt the transmission had been one-sided after all. Then Marcus said very quietly, "Okay." They sat in the sitting room, not touching, just occupying the same space. Serafina in the armchair where she'd first sat 2 weeks ago. Marcus on the sofa, his long frame arranged with the particular stillnesses of someone who had learned to be motionless for hours at a time. She didn't know when she fell asleep, but when she woke up, dawn light was coming through the windows and someone had draped a blanket over her. And Marcus was still there, still sitting on the sofa, still watching over her, still keeping her safe. The morning brought news that the vampire court session had been moved up. Day 20, tomorrow. The rogues were escalating. They knew the ledger existed. They knew what it contained. And they were trying to force Marcus's hand before he could present it properly. They want chaos, Marcus said, reading the summons that had been delivered by courier. They think if they move fast enough, I won't have time to prepare. They're wrong. Serafina looked at the calendar. The human court is day 22. If the vampire session is tomorrow, we have 1 day between. Less than that, the session will go late. These things always do, especially when there's a challenge to someone's authority. Marcus set down the summons. But we'll make it. I promised you that courtroom, Serafina, and I don't break promises. Not anymore. Theo arrived with the final analysis from the USB drive. More evidence, more names, a complete map of the trafficking operation stretching back 140 years, and woven throughout it the name Vivian Laurent. Not the current Vivian who poured coffee and drove Serafina. The previous one, the betrayer. The one who had sold Margot's location 43 years ago. Is this enough? Serafina asked, looking at the evidence spread across the table. It's more than enough, Marcus said. This is everything the court needs to issue a posthumous judgment, to acknowledge that Vivian Laurent violated every law we have, to make it official that she was a traitor. And the current Vivian, Marcus was quiet for a moment. She took the name in honor of her predecessor. That's how it works in our world. When someone falls, their name can be claimed by someone who wants to carry the legacy forward. The current Vivian believed she was honoring a loyal servant. She didn't know the truth. Will she still be loyal when she finds out? I don't know. That's what tomorrow will tell us. Serafina stayed at the townhouse again, not in the sitting room this time. Marcus had offered her a proper guest room, bed, bathroom, everything she might need. But before she went upstairs, she found him in his study, a room she hadn't seen before. Books floor to ceiling, a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of mahogany, papers and maps and what looked like correspondence dating back centuries. Can I ask you something? She said from the doorway. Marcus looked up from the document he was reviewing. Always. You said Vivian Laurent was the first person you turned, that you found her dying in a field hospital, that you gave her the choice. Yes. Did you love her? He was quiet for a long moment. Then, I thought I did. For about 50 years, I thought what we had was love. But it wasn't. It was gratitude. She was grateful to me for saving her life, and I was grateful to have someone who understood what I was. We confused gratitude for love, and it took us both a very long time to figure out the difference. When did you figure it out? When I met Margot. He set down the document. Not romantically. I never had those feelings for your grandmother, but Margot made me understand what it felt like to be truly known. To have someone look at me and see not the vampire king, not the 400-year-old immortal, but the person underneath. The one who made mistakes, who carried grief, who was just trying to do better than the century before. He looked at Serafina. Vivian never saw that person. She saw the king. She made every decision based on what she thought would protect or elevate the king. And in doing so, she destroyed the very thing she thought she was preserving. You don't know that the current Vivian will betray you. No, but I know that carrying that name creates expectations. And tomorrow when she learns what her predecessor did, she'll have to decide who she wants to be. The loyal lieutenant who keeps the name and all its baggage. Or someone new. Serafina stepped into the study. For what it's worth, I think she's more than just a name. What makes you say that? Because she makes my coffee perfect. And that level of attention to detail doesn't come from performing loyalty. It comes from actually caring. Marcus smiled, small, real, the first genuine smile Serafina had seen on his face. "You're going to be terrifying when you fully understand the power you have," he said. "What power? The power to make a 400-year-old vampire believe in hope again." He stood, crossed to where she was standing, and for the second time he reached out and touched her face, cool fingers against her skin. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "whatever the court decides, whatever chaos the rogues try to create, I want you to know that I don't regret this, any of it, meeting you, telling you the truth, standing beside you in that ballroom. I don't regret it, even if it costs you, especially if it costs me, because that's how I know it's real." He dropped his hand, started to step back. And this time Serafina didn't just catch his wrist. She kissed him. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't soft. It was 6 months of rage and grief and the sudden, overwhelming relief of being seen, of being known, of being valued instead of managed. Marcus made a sound, surprise maybe, or surrender. Then his hands were in her hair, and he was kissing her back like a man who had been waiting 400 years for permission to want something for himself. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder than they should have been, Marcus rested his forehead against hers. "I told myself I wouldn't do that," he said. "I told myself it wouldn't be fair to you. That you just escaped one man who tried to control you, and the last thing you needed was another one making decisions about what you wanted." "I'm making this decision," Serafina said. "Me. No one else. I'm choosing this." "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." He kissed her again, softer this time, like he was memorizing the shape of her mouth, the taste of her, the warmth of her skin against his coolness. When they finally pulled apart for the second time, Marcus said, "The court session is in 14 hours. "I know. After that, the human courtroom." "I know that too. And between now and then, Daniel is going to try something. The rogues are going to push him. They're running out of time and desperate people do stupid things. Let them try." Serafina stepped back, put distance between them before the pull got too strong to resist. "I'm not afraid anymore. I have the ledger. I have you. And in 48 hours, I'm going to watch Daniel Cross learn exactly what he lost when he decided I was worthless." She turned to leave. "Serafina," Marcus said. She looked back. "Thank you." "For what?" "For choosing this, for choosing me, for being brave enough to walk into a world that should terrify you and deciding it's worth it anyway." Serafina smiled, small, real, the first genuine smile she'd felt on her own face in longer than she could remember. "You're worth it," she said. Then she went upstairs to the guest room, climbed into bed, and slept deeply for the first time in 6 months. Because 2 floors below, a 400-year-old vampire king was sitting in his study surrounded by evidence of betrayal and proof of murder and the complete dismantling of a century-old trafficking operation. And he was smiling. The knock came at 5 in the morning. Serafina woke to darkness and the sound of someone moving in the hallway outside her room. She opened the door to find Vivian standing there fully dressed, her face pale. "They took him," Vivian said. "Utenina." "Who did Daniel? The rogues took Daniel 2 hours ago from his home." Serafina's heart stopped. "Where's Marcus?" "Already gone. He got the alert and left immediately. He told me to keep you here, to keep you safe." But Serafina was already moving, already pulling on clothes, already knowing exactly what this was. The rogues had Daniel, which meant they were going to use him as leverage, which meant the court session in 12 hours had just become a rescue mission, and Marcus had gone alone. Serafina was in the car before Vivian could finish the sentence about staying safe. "He told you to keep me here," Serafina said, buckling her seatbelt, "but he didn't order you not to drive me if I insisted on going." Vivian stared at her for exactly 3 seconds. Then something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. "You sound like Margot," Vivian said. "Good." They drove through pre-dawn Savannah, the city still sleeping, streets empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional taxi. The GPS led them south toward the industrial district, where the old warehouses hunched against the river like forgotten monuments. Marcus had left a trail, not accidentally. He'd known Serafina wouldn't stay behind, known Vivian would eventually cave, so he'd made sure they could follow. The abandoned hospital sat at the edge of the district, 5 stories of crumbling brick and broken windows. A building that had been scheduled for demolition 3 times and somehow kept surviving through bureaucratic delays and missing permits. Serafina understood why the moment she saw it. Vampire property. Had to be. The kind of real estate that existed in legal gray areas where human oversight never quite reached. Vivian parked 2 blocks away, killed the engine. I need you to understand something, Vivian said. If we go in there, we're walking into a trap. They took Daniel specifically to draw Marcus out, to force him into a confrontation before the court session. They're hoping he'll do something that violates vampire law, something that gives them grounds to challenge his authority. Then we don't let him violate vampire law. It's not that simple. If Daniel is hurt, if they've done anything to him, Marcus will want blood, literally. And if he takes it without court approval, he's no better than the rogues he's trying to destroy. Serafina looked at the hospital. Dawn was starting to break, pink light touching the upper windows. My grandmother spent 3 years gathering evidence because she believed in doing things the right way, Serafina said. She could have gone to the media, could have exposed everything in a way that would have forced immediate action. But she didn't. She built a case. She followed the rules. Because she understood that justice isn't the same thing as revenge. She opened the car door. I'm not going to let Marcus throw away 43 years of guilt and growth because Daniel Cross is too stupid to understand when he's being used. Vivian followed her out of the car. They approached the hospital from the east side, a service entrance with a door that hung crooked on broken hinges. The smell hit Serafina immediately. Rot and mildew, and something underneath that was distinctly copper. Blood. Old blood, the kind that had soaked into concrete and could never quite be scrubbed away. The interior was worse. Hallways with peeling paint. Gurneys rusted to the point of collapse. Equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum of medical horrors. And sounds. Voices drifting down from somewhere above. Marcus's voice. Cold and controlled, and carrying that particular edge that meant he was seconds away from violence. Serafina followed the sound. Up a stairwell that groaned under her weight. Down a corridor where the fluorescent lights flickered in patterns that made her head hurt. The voices were coming from what must have been an operating theater. Double doors, small windows reinforced with wire mesh. Serafina looked through the glass. Marcus stood in the center of the room, surrounded. 6 vampires in a loose circle, and sitting in a chair behind them, hands zip-tied, mouth bleeding from a split lip, was Daniel. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. The man who had controlled 6 years of her life reduced to a pawn in someone else's game. One of the vampires was speaking. A woman. Tall, elegant, with dark hair, and the kind of beauty that felt calculated rather than natural. You can't touch us, Marcus, not without court approval, not without violating every law you claim to uphold. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out of here. You're going to present your little ledger to the court, and we're going to present him. She gestured to Daniel, a human witness, ready to testify that you've been using undue influence on Serafina Hartley, that you've manipulated her into believing she's in danger, that you've isolated her from her legal husband and poisoned her mind against him. The court will have to investigate. And during that investigation, your authority will be suspended, and in that suspension will disappear, along with every piece of evidence you think you have. Marcus didn't move, didn't react. His face held that terrible stillness that meant he was calculating exactly how many seconds it would take to kill everyone in the room. You're assuming, Marcus said quietly, that I care more about vampire law than I do about the woman you're using him to threaten. We're assuming you care about your reputation, your position, the court you've built over 4 centuries. Are you really going to throw all of that away for a human without hesitation? The woman laughed. Then you're more far gone than we thought. How disappointing. Serafina pushed open the door. Every head turned. Marcus's face did something she'd never seen before. Terror, pure, undiluted terror, not for himself, for her. Serafina, get out. No. She walked into the room, Vivian behind her. I'm not leaving, and you're not going to do anything that violates vampire law, because that's exactly what they want. She looked at Daniel, at the blood on his lip, the fear in his eyes. Did you know, she asked him, did you know they were vampires when you agreed to help them? Daniel's face was answer enough. He'd known. Maybe not at first, but somewhere along the way someone had told him the truth, and he'd kept going anyway. You knew, Serafina said, and you helped them anyway, because you wanted me back, not because you loved me. Because you couldn't stand the idea that I'd left, that I'd chosen to be alone rather than be with you. They said they'd give me everything, Daniel said, his voice shaking. Money, power. They said I could have you back, that we could start over, that that I was property you'd misplaced, Serafina finished. That's all I ever was to you, wasn't it? A thing you owned. And when I left, it wasn't heartbreak you felt. It was the anger of someone who'd had something stolen. She turned to the dark-haired vampire. You made a mistake, Serafina said. You assumed Marcus was the only threat, that if you neutralized him, I'd be easy to manipulate. But my grandmother didn't hide the ledger in a place only her blood could access, because she thought I'd need a vampire to protect me. She did it because she knew I'd be smart enough to use it. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket, the letter from the Jasmine Garden, Margot's handwriting. This ledger contains 43 years of evidence. Evidence that the court will absolutely listen to. Evidence that doesn't need Marcus's testimony to be valid. Evidence that names every single one of you, your financial networks, your feeding patterns, your kills. The dark-haired vampire's expression changed. You don't know what you're... I know exactly what I'm holding, and I know that in Serafina checked her phone. 6 hours, the court of the Southern Reach will be in session. And I know that Marcus doesn't need to touch any of you to destroy you. He just needs to present the evidence. And I'm going to be the one presenting it. She looked at Marcus. You told me your grandmother made you understand what it felt like to be truly known, Serafina said. To have someone see not the vampire king, but the person underneath. The one trying to do better than the century before. She held his gaze. I see that person, Marcus, and that person doesn't break vampire law. That person doesn't give these parasites the satisfaction of watching him fall. That person walks out of here, leaves Daniel to face the consequences of his choices, and lets the court do what it was designed to do. The room was absolutely silent. Marcus's eyes held hers. She could see the war happening behind them. The 400 years of controlled isolation fighting against the desperate need to protect her. The vampire king fighting against the man. Finally, he nodded, once, sharp. You heard her, Marcus said to the dark-haired vampire. We're leaving. You can keep Daniel. He chose you. He can live with that choice. He walked towards Serafina, stopped beside her, looked down at Daniel. I told you weeks ago that the danger you represented was a nuisance, Marcus said, that you were nothing more than a parking violation. I was wrong. You're not even that. You're just a cautionary tale. The story people will tell about what happens when you're too small to recognize something extraordinary when you have it. He took Serafina's hand. They walked out together. Vivian following, down the corridor, down the stairs, out into the dawn light where the city was beginning to wake up. Behind them in the abandoned hospital, Daniel Cross sat with his hands zip-tied and his mouth bleeding, and the slow dawning understanding that he'd traded whatever remained of his humanity for the empty promise of control. And he'd lost anyway. The court of the Southern Reach met in a building that looked from the outside like a decommissioned church on Broughton Street. Pale brick, arched windows, a bell tower that hadn't held a bell in over a century. Inside it was something else entirely. A circular chamber 3 stories below ground level, ringed with seats carved from dark stone that might have been granite or might have been something older. Lit by fixtures that produced light without visible flame or filament. 47 vampires sat in those seats. The full membership of the court. Representatives from territories across the South, old ones and young ones, and everything in between. And in the center of the chamber, a raised platform where the accused would stand. Serafina sat in the gallery, the only human in the room. Every eye had found her when she'd entered. Assessed, calculated, tried to understand what she was doing here. Marcus had made it clear. She was under his protection. She was presenting evidence. And anyone who challenged her would answer to him. The dark-haired vampire from the hospital was already on the platform, along with 5 others. The rogues who had been running the trafficking operation. Who had killed Margot. Who had tried to use Daniel as leverage. They stood with their hands clasped behind their backs, no restraints. Vampire law didn't require physical bonds. The court itself was the bond. Leaving would mean forfeiting any claim to territory protection or rights within the Southern Reach. It would mean becoming truly rogue, truly hunted. Marcus stood at the prosecutor's position, a podium carved from the same dark stone as the seats. He wore black, no tie, the collar open, looking exactly like what he was. A king bringing charges against those who had violated his territory. The court recognizes Marcus Ashford, king of the Southern Reach, said a voice, an older vampire, gray-haired, sitting in the highest seat. State your charges. I bring charges of unauthorized feeding, human trafficking, murder, and conspiracy to undermine the authority of this court, Marcus said, his voice carrying through the chamber. Not loud, just absolutely clear. I bring evidence spanning 140 years, evidence gathered by Dr. Margot Hartley, a human pathologist who identified the pattern of kills and the network supporting them. Evidence that was hidden for 43 years and has now been recovered. He gestured to Serafina. She stood, walked to the platform, carried the ledger in her arms like it weighed what it actually represented. 43 years of her grandmother's life, hundreds of victims. A legacy of pain and the determined hope that someday someone would use it to demand justice. This is the ledger, Serafina said, her voice smaller than Marcus's, more human, but it carried anyway. My grandmother compiled it between 1980 and 1983. It contains documented evidence of kills, financial transfers, and the network of vampires who enabled and profited from human trafficking. She said it on the platform. It also contains evidence that the operation was funded and protected by someone in Marcus Ashford's inner circle, a vampire named Vivian Laurent, who served as his lieutenant for 170 years before betraying him to protect the operation she'd built. A murmur ran through the chamber, vampires leaning toward each other, whispered conversations. The gray-haired vampire raised a hand. Silence fell. These are serious charges, he said. Do you have proof beyond the documentation? Do you have testimony? I have my grandmother's voice, Serafina said. She nodded to Theo, who was operating the chamber's audio system from a control booth. He pressed a button, and Margot Hartley's voice filled the chamber. My name is Dr. Margot Hartley. I am recording this on October 12th, 1983. If you are hearing this, I am dead, and the people responsible for my death are listening to evidence they thought they'd buried. The recording ran for 20 minutes. Margot's voice, calm, clinical, laying out everything she'd found. The kills, the patterns, the financial networks, the names, and at the end, the betrayal. I was scheduled to meet Marcus Ashford tomorrow morning, to deliver this evidence, to ask for his protection while the court investigated. But tonight someone called me, someone who knew about the meeting, someone who told me to stay home, to wait, that Marcus would come to me instead. A pause. I know what that means. I know who made that call, and I know that by tomorrow I'll be dead, and this will look like a heart attack, and no one will investigate because I'm just a human who worked too hard and stressed herself into an early grave. Another pause. Longer. But I'm leaving this because my granddaughter will find it someday, and she'll be smart enough to use it. And when she does, I want the court to know that Vivian Laurent sold my location to the rogues, that she protected this operation for 170 years, that she believed she was serving Marcus by strengthening his position through intelligence gathered from the trafficking network. She was wrong. And I genuinely hope, that when she finally understands what she's done, it destroys her. The recording ended. The chamber was absolutely silent. Serafina looked at the accused vampires on the platform, at the dark-haired woman who had threatened Marcus in the hospital, at the 5 others who had built fortunes on human suffering. My grandmother believed in justice, Serafina said. She believed that evidence mattered, that the truth properly documented and properly presented would be enough. I'm here to prove she was right. The gray-haired vampire looked at Marcus. You've heard the evidence. What sentence do you request? Execution, Marcus said. No hesitation. For all 6, death by sunlight exposure, immediate. Another murmur, this one carrying shock. Execution was rare in vampire law, reserved for the worst violations, for those who threatened the very structure that kept vampire society functional. The court will deliberate, the gray-haired vampire said. The deliberation took 11 minutes. When the court reconvened, the verdict was unanimous. Guilty on all charges. Sentence execution by sunlight. To be carried out at dawn day 21. The 6 vampires were removed from the chamber. Silent. No protests. No begging. They'd known the risk when they'd built their operation. Known that someday the evidence might surface. They'd just gambled that it wouldn't happen in their lifetimes. They'd lost. As the chamber began to empty, the gray-haired vampire approached Marcus and Serafina. There's still the matter of Vivian Laurent, he said. She's dead, but the court needs to acknowledge her crimes to make it official. I understand, Marcus said. And there's the matter of the current Vivian, the one who carries the name. Marcus looked across the chamber to where Vivian stood. She'd been present for the entire session, listening to the recording, hearing the evidence, learning exactly what the name she'd claimed actually meant. That's her decision, Marcus said. She can renounce the name, choose something new, or she can carry it and work to redeem it. Either way, it's her choice. Vivian crossed the chamber, stopped in front of Marcus and Serafina. I didn't know, she said, her voice steady. I chose that name because I was told Vivienne Laurent was your most loyal servant, that she'd given everything for you. I wanted to honor that legacy. She paused. Now I know the truth, and I can't carry this name. Not after what she did, not after hearing Dr. Hartley's voice. She looked at Serafina. Your grandmother deserved better. You deserve better. What will you call yourself? Marcus asked. I don't know yet, but something that's mine. Something that doesn't carry anyone else's sins. She turned to leave, stopped, looked back. For what it's worth, I would have made the same choice Margot did. Evidence, documentation, justice through the proper channels. That's how you build something that lasts. Then she was gone. And Serafina stood in a vampire court 3 stories below Savannah with a ledger in her arms and the certain knowledge that her grandmother's voice had just destroyed a century-old trafficking operation and rewritten vampire law in the American South. The Chatham County Courthouse looked exactly like what it was. A government building, brick and glass, American flags, security checkpoints. The grinding machinery of human justice operating exactly the way it had been operating for centuries. Serafina sat at the respondent's table, her attorney beside her, a legal aid lawyer named Jessica, who was competent and underpaid and obviously outgunned by Daniel's attorney. Daniel's attorney was a man named Richard Sterling. Expensive suit, practiced smile, the kind of lawyer who charged $400 an hour and earned every cent through creative interpretation of the truth. Daniel sat beside him, looking better than he had in the hospital. The split lip healed. Dressed in his best suit, playing the role of wronged husband with the same dedication he'd brought to playing loving husband for 6 years. The hearing was supposed to be a formality. Daniel's motion didn't have strong legal standing, but formality had a way of becoming weaponized in courtrooms when one side had money and the other didn't. Judge Patricia Morrison entered. Everyone stood. She took her seat. The hearing began. Richard Sterling opened with practiced confidence, painting a picture of a woman who had been emotionally compromised during the divorce proceedings, who had made decisions under the influence of unnamed outside parties, who had hidden assets and misrepresented her mental state. It was lies. All of it. But they sounded good, professional, reasonable. Jessica did her best. She submitted documentation, photographs, messages, financial records showing Daniel's controlling behavior during the marriage. But Judge Morrison was looking at Daniel clean-cut and calm, and then looking at Serafina wearing a dress from a thrift store and working a job that barely paid rent, and the scales were starting to tilt in the familiar direction. Then the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Every head turned. Marcus Ashford had walked in. He wore black, a suit that probably cost more than Richard Sterling's retainer. He moved with that soundless grace, that particular quality of occupying space in a way that made everyone else feel like they were taking up too much of it. Behind him, a woman, blonde, mid-40s, carrying a leather portfolio, moving with the assurance of someone who had won cases in rooms far more intimidating than this. They took seats in the gallery, Marcus directly behind Serafina, close enough that she could feel the temperature drop 2 degrees, close enough that every person in the courtroom could see exactly where his attention was focused. Judge Morrison paused mid-sentence. Richard Sterling stopped writing. Jessica looked over her shoulder at Serafina with an expression of pure bewilderment. Daniel's face did something complicated. Panic wrapped in recognition, wrapped in the dawning understanding that he had miscalculated badly. The blonde woman stood. Your Honor, my name is Sienna Vale. I represent interests allied with the respondent. I'd like to submit additional documentation relevant to this hearing. Judge Morrison frowned. Counsel was not on the original filing. We're entering as amicus curiae, Your Honor. The documentation pertains to the petitioner's conduct during and after the marriage, as well as financial connections that are directly relevant to the motion before the court. Before Richard Sterling could object, Sienna opened her portfolio, presented a stack of documents, phone records, financial transfers, surveillance photographs showing Daniel meeting with individuals connected to organizations under federal investigation, private investigator reports, turned inside out, showing that Daniel had paid for illegal entry into Serafina's apartment, illegal surveillance of her workplace, illegal harassment that violated the existing restraining order in 14 documented instances. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents. Richard Sterling reviewed the documents. Daniel's face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, anger, denial, and then when he looked across the courtroom and finally truly saw Marcus Ashford looking back at him, fear. Marcus's gaze was steady, unhurried. He looked at Daniel the way you look at a math problem you solved a long time ago and have no interest in revisiting. Then Marcus leaned forward, close enough to Serafina that she could feel his breath against her ear. Cool, measured. He spoke. Not loud, just loud enough for Daniel to hear across the 20 feet of courtroom space between them. Let him watch what he lost. The words weren't meant for the room. They were meant for her and for Daniel. A statement and a promise and a reminder all at once. Serafina felt something settle in her chest. Not vindication, not triumph, relief. The specific physical relief of a weight being redistributed, shared, carried by someone who had the strength for it and the willingness to use that strength without asking for anything in return. Judge Morrison looked up from the documents. Mr. Sterling, does your client have an explanation for these records? Richard Sterling looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Marcus. Marcus looked back with the patient expression of someone who had all the time in the world. Your Honor, Daniel started. I'm not asking you, Mr. Cross. I'm asking your attorney. Richard Sterling cleared his throat. Your Honor, without time to review these documents in detail. The documents are quite detailed, Mr. Sterling. They show a pattern of harassment surveillance and what appears to be conspiracy to commit multiple felonies. They also suggest that your client has been in contact with individuals involved in ongoing federal investigations. She set down the documents. I'm denying the motion for annulment. Denied with prejudice, which means Mr. Cross cannot refile. Furthermore, I'm modifying the existing restraining order to make it permanent. Mr. Cross is not to contact, approach, or communicate with Mrs. Hartley in any way. Any violation will result in immediate arrest. She looked at Daniel. I'm also recommending that the district attorney's office review these surveillance records. What you've done, Mr. Cross, goes far beyond a contentious divorce. It enters the territory of stalking and criminal harassment. You should consider yourself fortunate that Ms. Hartley hasn't pressed charges yet. She brought down the gavel. We're adjourned. Daniel sat frozen. His attorney was already packing up, already calculating how to distance himself from a client who had just been publicly exposed as a criminal. Marcus stood, offered his hand to Serafina. She took it. They walked out of the courtroom together. Sienna following. Jessica looking dazed but pleased. And behind them, Daniel Cross sat at the petitioner's table with the ruins of his motion and the dawning understanding that he'd lost everything. Not just Serafina, his reputation, his standing in Savannah society, his freedom potentially if the district attorney decided to prosecute, all of it gone, because he'd been too small to recognize what he had when he had it. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. Not many. This was a divorce hearing, not a murder trial. But enough. Local news. A few freelancers who smelled a story about surveillance and federal investigations. They swarmed when Serafina and Marcus emerged. Ms. Hartley, can you comment on the judge's decision? Ms. Hartley, are you pressing charges against your ex-husband? Ms. Hartley, who is your companion? Marcus's hand tightened on hers. A question. Do you want to do this? Serafina stopped, faced the cameras. My ex-husband spent 6 years convincing me I had no value, she said, her voice steady, clear. He told me and everyone who knew us that I was worthless, that I served no purpose. She paused. Today a judge ruled that he was the one in violation, not me. Today the court recognized what he never could, that his accusations were these, that the only thing broken in our marriage was his judgment. Another pause. I'm not here to gloat. I'm here to tell every woman watching this who's been told she's not enough by a husband, a boyfriend, a family member, anyone, that you are not what they say you are. You are what you choose to be. And you have more power than they want you to know. She looked directly at the camera. Daniel Cross tried to erase me. Instead, he lost himself. That's what happens when you mistake control for love, when you confuse possession with partnership. You end up alone, and you deserve it. Marcus's hand in hers, steady, cool, anchoring. Are you and Mr. Ashford in a relationship? One reporter asked. Marcus answered before Serafina could. Mrs. Hartley is under my protection and has my complete support. Beyond that, her personal life is her own business. He looked at the reporters with that same cold precision he'd used on Daniel in the courtroom. And I'd suggest that anyone interested in her personal life remember that she's just demonstrated exactly how she handles people who try to control her narrative. I wouldn't recommend testing her patience. They walked to the car. Vivian was waiting behind the wheel. She'd already chosen a new name, Serafina noticed. The embroidered initials on her jacket no longer read VK. They read EO, Elena Laurent, not abandoning the past, transforming it. The drive back to the townhouse was quiet. Serafina watched the city pass. The same streets she'd walked for 6 months with a hole in her shoe. The same buildings she'd passed on her way to file autopsy reports in a basement that smelled like formaldehyde. Everything looked different now, not because the city had changed, because she had. The nursing program at Savannah State University had accepted her application in week 9. Full scholarship, anonymously funded. Serafina knew exactly who had funded it, but the paperwork listed it as the Margot Hartley Memorial Scholarship for Non-Traditional Students. The first time she'd seen her grandmother's name on official university letterhead, she'd cried for 20 minutes. Marcus had held her, said nothing. Just been present while she processed 43 years of grief compressed into a single moment of recognition. She'd moved into the townhouse in week 7, not because Marcus had asked, because it had stopped making sense to maintain 2 residences when she spent every night at his place anyway. She'd kept the studio apartment for a month after moving out, just in case, just to have the safety net. Then she'd let it go, because safety nets were for people who were afraid of falling, and Serafina wasn't afraid anymore. Ruth had retired in week 10, handed over the ME office to a new manager, spent her last day smoking menthols and telling Serafina stories about Margot. She'd be proud of you, Ruth had said, not because you found the ledger, because you used it exactly the way she hoped someone would, with precision, with patience, with absolute conviction that the truth matters. The new position had been created specifically for Serafina, vampire-human liaison to the court of the Southern Reach. Her job was to help navigate the intersection between vampire law and human law, to make sure that when the 2 worlds touched, they did so without leaving bodies behind. It was perfect. It used everything she'd learned in 6 months of filing Red Seal reports, everything she'd learned in 6 years of surviving Daniel, everything she'd learned in 3 months of watching Marcus balance centuries of tradition with the desperate need to evolve. The office was on the 2nd floor of the townhouse, windows overlooking the garden where Elena had planted new jasmine, a desk that was actually Margot's desk, rescued from storage and refinished. The classroom was on the 3rd floor of the health sciences building, 25 students, most of them 10 years younger than Serafina, a few older, all of them there because they wanted to help people, and nursing was how they'd chosen to do it. Professor Chen was lecturing on triage protocols when the door opened. A late arrival slipped in, took a seat in the back row. Serafina glanced up from her notes. Marcus sat in the back of her nursing classroom, looking completely out of place in his charcoal suit and completely unbothered by the fact that he was the only non-student in the room. Professor Chen paused. "Can I help you?" "Just auditing," Marcus said. "Don't mind me." Professor Chen looked like she wanted to mind very much, but something about Marcus's tone suggested that arguing would be futile. She went back to her lecture. Serafina tried to focus on triage protocols, on the difference between immediate, delayed, and expectant categories, on how to make impossible decisions in impossible situations. But she was aware of Marcus in the back row, aware of the way every other student kept glancing at him, aware of the fact that a 400-year-old vampire king was sitting through an undergraduate nursing lecture just to be near her. After class, she found him waiting in the hallway. "You can't just show up to my classes," she said. "Why not?" "Because it's weird. Because you make everyone uncomfortable. Because Professor Chen looked like she was going to call security. Professor Chen looked like she was trying to figure out where she knew me from. I donated the funds for this building in 1997. Different name, obviously, but she's been here long enough to remember." He smiled, small, real. "Besides, I wanted to see you in your element. Wanted to watch you do the thing Daniel tried to take away from you." Serafina's chest did something complicated. "I have another class in 20 minutes. I'll walk you." They walked through campus, fall turning to winter, students bundling up against the cold. Serafina in jeans and a sweater that Marcus had bought her after she'd complained that all her clothes were either work-appropriate or thrift store formal. "I saw Daniel yesterday," Marcus said. Serafina stopped walking. Where? He's working at a car dealership. Sales. Entry level. Apparently his legal troubles made him unemployable in his previous field. Good. He looked smaller, diminished, like someone had let the air out of him. I don't want to hear about Daniel. I know, but I thought you should know that he's not a threat anymore, that he's not coming back, that you can stop looking over your shoulder. Serafina started walking again. I stopped looking over my shoulder the day you sat behind me in that courtroom. They reached the next building. Marcus stopped at the entrance. I have a court session tonight. Southern Reach business. Should be done by midnight. I'll be at home, working on my anatomy homework. Home, not the townhouse, not Marcus's place. Home. Elena made lasagna, Marcus said. She's still trying out the name. It might stick. It suits her better than Vivian ever did. Serafina laughed. Real, full, the kind of laugh she'd forgotten she was capable of. I'll see you tonight, she said. Marcus kissed her, quick, chaste, appropriate for a college campus. Then he was gone, disappearing around the corner with that soundless grace. Serafina went to her anatomy class, sat in the middle row, opened her textbook, and realized that for the first time in her entire adult life, she was exactly where she wanted to be, doing exactly what she wanted to do, with exactly who she wanted beside her. Later that afternoon, Serafina sat at Margot's desk reviewing a case file when her phone rang. Ruth's number. I thought you retired, Serafina said. I did, but they called me in for a consult. New Red Seal case. And honey, you need to see this. What is it? It's international. The markers are the same as what Margot was tracking. But the origin code suggests this goes way beyond the Southern Reach. This goes global. Serafina set down her pen. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She hung up, looked around the office, at Margot's desk, at the jasmine visible through the window, at the life she'd built from $9 and a hole in her shoe. Then she stood, grabbed her jacket, because the work wasn't done. The ledger had dismantled one operation, but Margot had suspected there were more, bigger networks, deeper rot, and Serafina was her grandmother's blood, which meant finishing what Margot started wasn't just a choice. It was a legacy. 6 months after Daniel Cross decided she was worthless, Serafina Hartley stood in front of a lecture hall, not as a student, as a guest speaker. The course was called Vampire Human Relations, an elective, new to the university curriculum, funded by an anonymous donor who everyone suspected was Marcus Ashford, but no one could prove. 20 students filled the seats, watching her, waiting. Serafina looked at them, at their young faces, at their notebooks open and ready, at their complete lack of understanding about what the world actually contained. My name is Serafina Hartley, she said. 6 months ago, my ex-husband publicly stated I had no value. Today, I'm going to tell you about the 400-year-old vampire king who proved him wrong, and about my grandmother who spent 3 years building a case against monsters because she believed the truth was worth dying for, and about what I learned when I found her research and used it to dismantle a human trafficking operation that had been running for over a century. She paused. But first, I'm going to tell you the most important lesson I've learned in the last 6 months, the one that matters more than anything else. The students leaned forward. You are not what other people say you are. You are not their labels. You are not their limitations. You are not their failure of imagination. You are exactly what you choose to be. And if someone tries to tell you otherwise, you gather evidence, you build a case, and you prove them wrong so thoroughly that they spend the rest of their lives wondering how they were ever stupid enough to underestimate you. In the back row, Marcus Ashford sat with a slight smile on his face, watching the woman he'd failed to protect 43 years ago get her justice through her granddaughter. Watching the woman he'd waited 400 years to find finally understand her own power. Watching Serafina Hartley transform from victim to survivor, to victor, to teacher. And knowing that the story wasn't over. It was only beginning. Outside the lecture hall, Ruth stood in the corridor with a Red Seal file in her hands, waiting, because the world had more monsters than anyone wanted to admit, but it also had Serafina Hartley, and that Ruth thought was exactly the kind of balance Margot had been hoping for, the kind of balance that didn't just preserve evidence, it created change.